They laughed as they trashed his truck, mocking the quiet veteran and stomping on his flag. "Know your place, old man," their leader sneered. They thought he was helpless. They had no idea who he really was or how their actions would come back to haunt them. But let's start from the beginning. Richard "Rick" Holloway, a 58-year-old veteran, had dedicated his life to service, and retirement hadn't changed that. With wildfires ravaging Los Angeles, Rick spent his days loading up his trusty, slightly battered pickup truck with water, canned food, and medical supplies, delivering them to shelters in fire-stricken neighborhoods. A small, meticulously kept American flag fluttered on the back of his truck, a quiet nod to his years of military service. The afternoon sun beat down as Rick turned onto a narrow road that passed by a local biker club. Outside the building, a group of men leaned against their gleaming motorcycles, laughter and music spilling out onto the street. The bikers, clad in leather vests and smirks, exuded a mix of arrogance and disregard for anyone but themselves. As Rick's truck slowed to navigate the blocked road, all eyes turned to him. "Look what we've got here," a booming voice called out. It was Chuck, the group's leader, a hulking figure with a grin as sharp as his tone. He strode toward Rick's truck with exaggerated swagger, his boots crunching on the gravel. "What's the old man hauling? Bingo snacks for the nursing home?" Rick stopped his truck, rolled down the window, and met Chuck's gaze with an unflinching calm. "Emergency supplies," he replied evenly, "for people who've lost their homes." Chuck tilted his head, feigning interest. Then, with a dramatic wave of his arm, he motioned for his men to follow. "Let's take a look, boys." Before Rick could say another word, the bikers were at his truck, pulling crates from the bed. One grabbed a bottle of water, twisted off the cap, and dumped it onto the ground with mock sympathy. "Oops, guess they'll be thirsty," he sneered. Another man, skinnier and meaner looking, snatched the small flag from Rick's truck. "Oh look, the Patriot brought his lucky charm," he shouted, tossing the flag onto the ground and stomping on it. Laughter erupted from the group, loud and grating, as they continued to empty Rick's truck. Rick stepped out, his movements slow but deliberate. He bent down, picked up the dirtied flag, and brushed it off with care. Despite the jeers and insults, he stood tall, his expression unreadable. "Look at this guy," Chuck said, laughing, as he grabbed a crate of canned goods and chucked it onto the ground, scattering the contents. "You really think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" Rick met Chuck's mocking gaze, his calm demeanor never faltering. "Heroes don't waste time explaining themselves," he said quietly, his voice firm but low enough to make the bikers lean in to hear. Chuck snorted, clearly unimpressed. "You're lucky we're in a good mood, old-timer. Get out of here before we decide to take that truck for a ride." Rick didn't respond. He simply folded the flag with military precision, placed it carefully on the passenger seat, and climbed back into his truck. As he drove away, the sound of the bikers' laughter faded into the distance. But in the rearview mirror, Rick's steady hands gripped the wheel tightly, and his eyes reflected more than just the sunlight. They burned with quiet determination. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next day, Rick returned with another load of supplies. His old truck, now cleaned and loaded with fresh crates of water, food, and basic necessities, creaked as it rolled down the same road. The American flag once again flew from its bed, freshly washed and proudly displayed. Rick's expression was calm, but his jaw was set, a quiet determination guiding him forward. He didn't expect trouble, though he wasn't surprised to find it. As he approached the same biker club, he saw them waiting for him. Their motorcycles formed an impassable blockade across the narrow road, engines revving like growling beasts. Chuck stood at the center, arms crossed, and a smug grin plastered across his face. "Well, well, look who's back," Chuck called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "You just can't stay away, can you, Grandpa?" Rick stopped his truck but didn't step out. Instead, he rolled down his window and met Chuck's gaze with the same unflinching calm that had thrown the bikers off balance the day before. "Move," Rick said simply. Chuck laughed, a loud, exaggerated sound, as if Rick had just told the world's funniest joke. "Move? Oh, I don't think so. We're having too much fun with you, old man." The other bikers cheered in agreement. One of them, a wiry man with a bandana, sauntered up to Rick's truck. He carried a can of paint in one hand and shook it menacingly. Let's give his ride a new look, huh? Before Rick could respond, the man sprayed a thick streak of neon paint across the hood of the truck. The crowd erupted in laughter. Another biker seized the moment to kick one of the truck's tires, toppling it onto its side with a loud crash. The supplies spilled out, scattering onto the ground. "Oops," Chuck said, feigning surprise. "Guess your delivery's been canceled." A crowd of bystanders began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Some held up their phones, recording the scene with expressions ranging from shock to dismay. But no one stepped forward to intervene. Chuck grabbed a crate of food, lit a match, and set the corner ablaze, holding it high like a twisted trophy. "Hope your friends like their meals extra crispy," he jeered. Rick finally stepped out of the truck. His movements were deliberate and steady, a stark contrast to the chaos around him. He picked up the flag that had fallen in the commotion, brushing off the dirt with the same meticulous care as before. The bikers fell quiet for a moment, watching him with a mix of amusement and confusion. Rick straightened, holding the flag tightly in his hands. He turned to Chuck, his gaze sharp enough to pierce through the man's bravado. "You're going to regret touching this," Rick said, his voice low and even. Chuck barked a laugh, but it wasn't as confident as before. "Oh yeah, and what are you going to do, Grandpa? Knit me a sweater?" The bikers laughed again, but the sound was hollow. Something in Rick's tone had unsettled them. Even Chuck, for all his bluster, seemed to hesitate under Rick's unwavering stare. Rick didn't respond. He simply walked past Chuck, picked up a spilled bottle of water, and calmly returned it to the truck's bed. His silence spoke louder than words, and the tension in the air became palpable. "You got guts, I'll give you that," Chuck said, trying to regain control of the moment. "But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered." Rick paused, glancing over his shoulder. Sometimes it's not about numbers. It's about knowing which battles are worth fighting. The crowd murmured, some clearly siding with Rick now. A woman whispered to her friend, "He's not scared of them at all." As Rick climbed back into his truck, one of the younger bikers muttered, "Maybe we shouldn't mess with this guy anymore." Chuck snapped at him. "Shut it, he's just an old man." Rick drove off, his truck battered but his resolve unshaken. Behind him, the bikers stood in uneasy silence, their earlier laughter replaced by an undercurrent of doubt. In his rearview mirror, Rick saw the crowd dispersing, but he knew the story wasn't over. Not yet. A few days later, chaos erupted at the biker clubhouse. Flames licked at the edges of the property as the wildfire crept closer. Thick smoke clouded the air, and the once boisterous bikers now ran frantically, shouting over one another. Their precious motorcycles, the pride of their club, were hastily being wheeled away, but it was clear they wouldn't have time to save everything. Chuck, usually the embodiment of arrogance, was sweating profusely. "Get those bikes out first. Leave the rest," he barked, though his voice betrayed a hint of panic. As the inferno drew nearer, the sound of a familiar truck engine cut through the crackling fire. Rick Holloway, calm as ever, pulled up just beyond the chaos. He stepped out of his battered pickup, hands in his pockets, and watched the scene unfold with quiet interest. Chuck spotted him almost immediately and stormed over, his panic replaced by a flash of anger. "You here to gloat, old man?" he snapped, his voice edged with desperation. "Go ahead, laugh it up while we burn." Rick raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "I'm delivering supplies," he said simply, motioning to the crates in his truck bed. "For those who need them," Chuck scoffed, gesturing wildly at the encroaching fire. "You think we need your charity? We don't need anything from you." Rick's gaze shifted past Chuck to the clubhouse. The flames were dangerously close now, and the frantic movements of the bikers only made their plight more apparent. He didn't say a word, letting the crackling fire and Chuck's ragged breathing fill the silence. Before Chuck could fire off another insult, the rumble of engines grew louder. 3 military trucks rolled into view, their arrival cutting through the tension like a knife. The trucks came to a halt, and a group of men in uniform jumped out, moving with the efficiency and discipline that could only come from experience. One of the men, a tall figure in crisp military attire, approached Rick with purpose. He stopped, stood at attention, and gave a sharp salute. "General Holloway," the man said, his voice steady and formal, "we're ready for your orders." The air seemed to freeze. Chuck's mouth fell open, his earlier bravado vanishing like smoke in the wind. The other bikers, who had been scrambling to save their belongings, stopped in their tracks, their confusion quickly turning to realization. Rick nodded at the officer. "Captain Morris, good timing. The fire's moving fast. and they're going to need all the help they can get, Chuck stammered, struggling to find his voice. Wait, General? You're a... Rick turned to face him, his expression calm but firm. I served my country long before I met you, Chuck, but I don't need a title to do the right thing. The bikers stood frozen, their usual confidence replaced by stunned silence. Captain Morris, noticing the group, leaned toward Rick. What about them, sir? He asked, nodding toward the bikers. Do we assist? Rick's gaze lingered on Chuck and his men, their faces now painted with a mix of shame and fear. He thought for a moment before answering. We'll save the clubhouse, Rick said finally, his voice steady, but they'll fix every bit of damage they've done. Chuck's eyes widened, but he didn't dare argue. The other bikers exchanged uneasy glances, knowing they had little choice but to accept whatever terms were coming. Rick turned back to Captain Morris. Let's move. We don't have time to waste. The military team sprang into action, working alongside the bikers to contain the fire and save the clubhouse. The bikers' earlier hostility was replaced with begrudging cooperation as they scrambled to follow orders. For the first time, Chuck's voice was absent from the chaos, his usual commands replaced with silence as he followed Rick's lead. When the last flames were extinguished and the danger had passed, Rick stood by his truck, watching as the bikers assessed the damage. Chuck approached him hesitantly, his earlier arrogance nowhere to be found. I don't know what to say, Chuck admitted, his tone subdued. You didn't have to help us. Rick folded his arms, his expression unreadable. You're right. I didn't. Chuck looked down, unable to meet Rick's eyes. We'll fix it. Everything we broke, I swear. Rick nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Good, that's a start. As Rick climbed back into his truck, one of the younger bikers called out, Wait, why'd you do it? After everything we did? Rick paused, looking back over his shoulder. Because sometimes doing the right thing isn't about them, he said, nodding toward the clubhouse. It's about you. With that, he drove off, leaving the bikers to reflect on the man they'd underestimated and the lesson they wouldn't soon forget. With Rick's leadership and his team's coordinated efforts, the fire was extinguished before it could claim the biker clubhouse. The once proud bikers, now subdued and shaken, worked alongside the military team, moving their motorcycles and salvaging what they could. Their leather jackets, once symbols of bravado, now seemed more like shields against their growing sense of shame. Chuck, who had barked commands to his crew only hours earlier, now silently helped drag debris out of the way. Every so often, he glanced at Rick, his face a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. For the first time in a long while, Chuck had nothing to say. The next day, the scene outside the clubhouse was vastly different. Under the watchful eyes of local residents, journalists, and even a few cameras, Chuck and his gang worked diligently to repair the damage they had caused. Rick's old pickup truck stood nearby, freshly washed and gleaming despite its age. The American flag that once fluttered proudly at its back had been carefully cleaned and returned to its rightful place. A makeshift podium had been set up near the clubhouse, and Chuck stood behind it, shifting uncomfortably. He was flanked by his crew, who looked equally uneasy. The hum of murmured conversations and the buzz of cameras filled the air as the crowd waited for Chuck to speak. Finally, with a deep breath, Chuck stepped forward. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by an unfamiliar humility. We were wrong, Chuck began, his voice steady but quieter than usual. We disrespected a man who's done more for this country, and for people, than we'll probably ever do in our lives. The crowd stilled, their murmurs replaced by the clicking of cameras. Chuck gestured toward Rick, who stood to the side, arms crossed, watching with an unreadable expression. General Holloway, Chuck continued, we owe you an apology, not just for what we did to you, but for forgetting what real strength and leadership look like. There was a beat of silence, and then Chuck turned back to the audience. We've started fixing everything we damaged, and we'll keep fixing it until it's right. The crowd erupted into applause, and a wave of relief seemed to pass through the bikers. They weren't out of the woods yet, but this was a start. Cameras panned to Rick, who stepped forward, his face calm but resolute. You're right, Rick said, addressing Chuck. You were wrong, but admitting that is the first step to change. He paused, letting his words sink in. Next time, before you try to intimidate someone, think twice. You never know what they've been through, or who they are. The crowd roared with approval, and Chuck nodded, his face flushed but determined. Rick's tone wasn't harsh, but it carried a weight that made it impossible to ignore. As the crowd began to disperse, Chuck approached Rick. He hesitated for a moment before speaking, his voice low enough that only Rick could hear. "Thanks," Chuck said, glancing down at his boots. "You saved us, even when you didn't have to." Rick looked at him for a long moment before a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "We don't fight fire with fire, Chuck, but remember this, justice always wins." With that, Rick turned and climbed into his truck. The engine rumbled to life, and the small flag fluttered once more as he drove away. Behind him, the bikers watched in silence, their expressions a mix of respect and determination to live up to the second chance they'd been given. As the video of Chuck's public apology spread online, Rick's story captured hearts across the nation. The man who had quietly worked to help others, even in the face of ridicule, became a symbol of resilience and dignity. And while Rick never sought recognition, he couldn't ignore the newfound respect from those around him.